Good morning. I'm Representative Verla Insko, House District 56, Orange County. We're here today to discuss House Bill 740, ending North Carolina's involvement in torture. I'm glad to have Representative Pricey Harrison with me here today as a primary sponsor, and Representative Meyer has a committee meeting, as do many other people. We've known since 2005 New York Times article that North Carolina was involved in the post-9/11 practice of rendition and torture. That happened through flights that originated in Johnston County, flew to other countries to pick up prisoners of the United States government and deliver them to a third country where torture is legal. The other prisoners would be tortured under the illusion that they might reveal information that would be helpful to us and our allies. Based on international law that the United States is party to, torture is illegal. Not only is it illegal, it doesn't work. Worse yet, it is counterproductive. Multiple studies have demonstrated that there are easier ways to get reliable information from prisoners. Information gained from tortured prisoners is so inaccurate that it often leads to our making more mistakes and doing more damage. No American should ever be involved in it in any way. State legislators here in North Carolina have the means to assure that will not take place in North Carolina. Some of you will remember two bills that were filed in 2007 by Representative Paul Lupke and Representative Harrison on this topic. This year we filed House Bill 740 in response to a major report on the issue by the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. And we will hear from those speakers today. Dr. Christine Cowger is a founding member and coordinator of North Carolina Stop Torture Now. She's a founder of the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. She's also a plant pathology at North Carolina State University. Catherine Reed joins us as the Executive Director for the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. Prior to her current position, Ms. Reed led two Washington, D.C. based organizations, Crisis Action and the Center for Victims of Torture. Professor James Coleman, an NCCIT commissioner, is the John Bradway Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility at Duke Law School. Patricia McGaffagan is also an NCCIT commissioner, and she's a trauma psychologist and a Johnston County resident. Professor Deborah Weissman, the Reef C. Ivy Distinguished Professor of Law at UNC, will also speak. She serves as the legal advisor for the commission. And Jennifer Copeland is with us today as the Executive Director of the North Carolina Council of Churches. And these speakers will speak in that order. I turn it over now to Dr. Cowger.
Thank you very much, Representative Insko. Thank you for hosting us here today. As you said, we're here today because 14 years ago it was discovered that the CIA has chosen North Carolina, and specifically our public airports, for some of its dirtiest work. That work may be ongoing. The CIA picked our state to carry out a huge global program of kidnapping and torture. After 9/11, Vice President Cheney told the world we would be working the dark side. In 2005, we learned that meant the CIA was using Aero Contractors, a nominally private company, to operate its torture taxis. They hid these rendition aircraft in plain sight. The most notorious, called the Guantanamo Express, was stationed at Aero's headquarters at the Johnston County Airport. When they needed more capacity, they got permission to keep a larger Boeing business jet at the Global Trans Park in Kinston. Then the state allowed them to build a hangar specifically to house that rendition plane. Here's a typical mission. The planes took off from North Carolina. They stopped at Dulles Airport to take on a CIA snatch team. Then they refueled in the UK, in Ireland. They flew on to one of 16 foreign countries like Sweden, Pakistan, the Gambia. Local security forces handed over a prisoner. In eerie silence, no word spoken. The snatch team beat him. They sliced off his clothes. They forcibly searched his cavities. They drugged him and put him in a diaper, jumpsuit, hood, or mask, goggles, earmuffs, and shackled him to the floor of the plane. He thought he was going to be killed. He was filled with dread and terror. And on the long flight, he was kicked and cursed if he tried to ask questions or move. When he arrived, the rest of the carefully designed torture program unfolded. Beatings, prolonged painful stress positions, forced nudity, sexual abuse and humiliation, temperature extremes, isolation, constant loud music, and on, some of them rendered to multiple locations for this treatment over periods of years when no one knew where they were. We know that at least 119 human beings were subjected to this. It happened at the infamous black sites. These were secret prisons set up in 6 countries around the globe to hide the CIA's detention and torture program. We know 34 of those 119 were flown by Aero contractors. Aero's pilots serviced most of the 10 black site prisons. Sometimes they filed false flight plans to hide their routes. In addition, at least 15 more prisoners were flown by Aero for the CIA to be tortured by allies like Morocco, Egypt, Syria. Not even the Senate has looked into these renditions to foreign proxies, so no one knows how many there were, and no one knows what became of those prisoners. Never any accountability. Those who designed and carried out the torture program have been promoted. Indeed, one of them is now head of the CIA. The victims, most of whom had no connection to terrorism, have never received a word of acknowledgement or apology from the US government. We North Carolinians have been forced to support this with our tax dollars. The Transportation Department gives grants to fortify Aero's corner of the Johnson County Airport so people of faith cannot get near to vigil. Torture stains our reputation as a state, and in that way it is like eugenics or lynching. But our state government is sleepwalking, or worse. At the latest, Governor Easley learned about this in 2006 when the North Carolina Council of Churches and other groups met with him, and since then dozens of organizations and thousands of individuals have called for investigation. Governor Perdue decided to do nothing. Starting in 2007, Attorney General Cooper insisted to state legislators that he had no power to do anything. Governor McCrory declined to even meet, and this is a bipartisan problem. Both Governor Cooper and Attorney General Stein have refused to say publicly that torture is wrong and we should not be involved in it. Aero tells the county they have 130 employees. We know 40 or 50 of their pilots have flown rendition missions. Are those missions ongoing? If our state government knows, they're not telling. No one is investigating. Our president admires torture, even though the military tells him it doesn't work. Our CIA director refuses to call it immoral. It is perfectly possible that Aero continues to fly torture taxis, and that's why we need HB 740. Oh, and I want to say, those who have suffered from the rendition program are watching to see what we do. The wife of Abu el-Qasim Britel, a survivor, says, "We hope that this bill for the end of North Carolina's involvement in torture will be passed. It is a needed initiative to try to obtain one day a little of the justice which we have long awaited for my husband Abu el-Qasim Britel."
Hi, I'm Catherine Reed. I served as Executive Director of the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. You've heard from Christina that since Aero contractors in North Carolina's role became apparent, a grassroots network of people of faith and people of conscience has been organising in North Carolina to seek transparency and accountability. This group of dedicated activists supported the creation of the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. The Commission was officially launched in March 2017 as a non-governmental, non-partisan organisation. Its mission to investigate and establish public accountability for the role that our government and state resources played in helping to facilitate the US rendition and torture program. The NCCIT included a blue ribbon panel of 10 policy experts, academics, veterans, including Jim Coleman and Patty McGaffagan here today. It was established to do the job that government has refused to do: investigate North Carolina's involvement in the US torture program, educate the public about it, prevent it from happening again, and to make North Carolina a leader against torture and rendition. The Commission held public hearings in Raleigh in December 2017, including testimony from national security experts, former detainees and their families, lawyers, doctors, and interrogators. It conducted a careful process of investigation and research with the support of Duke and UNC law schools, submitted public records requests, and last September released its groundbreaking report, Torture Flights: North Carolina's Role in the CIA Rendition and Torture Program, which is available at nctorturereport.org. The report reveals that North Carolina's role in the CIA program was larger than previously thought. North Carolina-based aero contractors carried out 80% of all CIA renditions between September 2001 and March 2004. 48 men and 1 woman who was 4 months pregnant at the time of her rendition. In Chapter 4 of the report, a database of these detainees, including where they came from, where they were rendered to, and what their current status is. The Commission heard from survivors of the program and psychologists that the very process of rendition was designed to dehumanize the individual and was so brutal that it constituted part of their torture. The report also highlights, through the public records requests, the neglect and dismissive tactics employed by state officials, including the former Attorney General, now Governor, Roy Cooper, towards citizens and their calls for accountability. As you heard from Christina, despite dozens of formal requests made by citizens to state elected officials, records requests reveal that there was no evidence of internal deliberations by the North Carolina Department of Justice or the governor's staff on what to do about the state's role in torture. Instead, elected leaders seem to regard torture opponents with suspicion. And finally, central for the discussion today, the report also includes an exploration of North Carolina's legal obligations and its options for action in the face of federal inaction. The report includes recommendations for federal and state policy change, and we are very pleased to see some of them incorporated into this bill. HB 740 would allow our state to start addressing its participation in rendition and torture. It removes barriers to investigation by the Attorney General, allows past violations to be addressed, and helps ensure further renditions to torture are not unwittingly aided by North Carolina taxpayers. North Carolina citizens have shown that they have the stamina and determination to prevent the use of torture and rendition by their state, and will not stop until that is accomplished. Indeed, in the report's foreword, written by former General Counsel of the Navy, Alberto Mora, he writes of these citizens: "As important as the content of torture flights are, an equally important story is to be found in the story behind the story. That is the character, grit, and persistence of the North Carolina citizens whose tenacity to uncover how their state was used in the CIA program led to the formation of the NCCIT. When concerned citizens first learned that rendition flights involved in the torture program operated out of North Carolina, these individuals acted, and they have not stopped acting. They investigated, protested, cajoled, disrupted, rallied others to their cause, called on local and state authorities to perform their duties, organized, fundraised, and helped launch the Commission. Torture flights and the Commission are many things, but they also represent citizen behavior at the highest pitch of civic responsibility, models of grassroots citizen engagement and action, and an inspiration to all Americans."
Thank you. I'm Jim Coleman. I'm a law professor at Duke University, and I served on the commission. I'm here to support HB 740 and particularly to speak about 2 of the provisions which would authorize the Attorney General to convene a grand jury to investigate conduct such as that engaged in by aero contractors, and also give the Attorney General the authority to prosecute crimes under North Carolina law that were violated by this conduct. One of the things that the Commission did was to look into the existing law and authority, both for the federal government and for the state of North Carolina, to investigate and prosecute the kind of conduct that the Commission found had been carried on here in North Carolina. We think the law is clear, both federal law and state law, that there is authority both to investigate this conduct and also to prosecute it. When we met with the Attorney General after the report was issued, his representatives raised a question whether the Attorney General had the authority either to investigate or to prosecute these crimes. We think that is a legitimate issue to raise, and HB 740 would address that by making it clear that the Attorney General has the authority to convene a grand jury to conduct an appropriate investigation, and if warranted, also to prosecute the conduct. It's ironic that these issues of this conduct was raised by citizens, brought to the attention of public officials, and they did nothing. I hope that this bill, if enacted and becomes law, would change that.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Patty McGaffagan, and I am a commissioner and also a resident of Johnston County. I'd like to thank Representatives Insko, Harrison, and Myers, and others for co-sponsoring this bill. I moved to Johnston County after graduate school and have lived there since the early 80s. The reason I live there is because it's beautiful, it's rural, people are nice. And when I found out what was going on at the airport, it kind of shattered my illusions about our country, about our county, and the morality that to me forms the underpinning of what it means to be an American. Some friends of mine informed me, Allison Kaysen being one, about what was going on at Aero Contractors, and I found it really hard to believe, honestly, that a few miles from my home, people were being, flights were leaving to, for the purpose of torturing, taking people to other places and torturing them. And so, you know, it took a while for me to get involved, but when I did, I can't stress enough how traumatic it was for me to hear about the things that have been done to other people. I talk to a lot of people. Being a psychologist, I'm in contact with a lot of people in and around Johnston County, and most people have no idea what happened when I tell them.
Excuse me, sir. Come over here.
That's okay. So most people don't know what happened at the Johnston County Airport or at Kinston, and when they are told, I get one of two reactions. One is that they're in disbelief and they say, well, what can we do to stop this? Or they say, well, I think torture is a good idea. And I think that's fairly representative of what's going on in our country now, that about half the population thinks that torture may be a good thing. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. I think we need to educate people that not only is it immoral, it doesn't produce any good evidence or information about terrorism. That being said, I'd like to just briefly address the local efforts to make county commissioners and others aware of what we found with the commission. I spoke before the county commissioners last fall. They're very polite, but skeptical. I have been in meetings where I've heard them say that they also think torture is a good idea, that Aero Contractors is a good tenant, that this is not under their purview, that this is above their pay grade, so to speak. And so I think that this bill will do a lot to clarify what the role of each governmental authority is in investigating and determining what the actions to take regarding what happened in the past, but also going forward. I have no faith that this won't continue. And this, to me, is unconscionable. We have, you know, a few miles, like I said, a few miles from my house, the thought that this could be going on now and into the future. It chills me and causes me not to be able to sleep at night sometimes, because these are human beings, and if we do not respect the civil rights of every human being, then who's going to respect ours? So thank you for your time.
Good morning, my name is Deborah Weissman. I teach law at the University of North Carolina School of Law at Chapel Hill. And I want to thank Representatives Insko, Harrison, Black Montgomery, the primary sponsors for this very important bill, which I believe starts to bring us in line with our international legal obligations, both as a state and its political subdivisions and private actors. So what are the state's obligations to survivors of extraordinary rendition and torture that resulted due to the CIA torture program? Our obligation is clear, according to law, at all levels, starting at the international level. International legal obligations include the prohibition on torture, requires the accountability and investigation when there are credible allegations of torture, and it also requires reparations to the survivors and their families. We have heard time and again from state and local officials that the enforcement of international law doesn't fall within their province, but that rather it's a matter for the federal government, but that is an inaccurate statement of the law. There are fundamental principles of international law that require no treaty, no statute, no formal enactment, and those we call jus cogens, or relatedly customary international law, and they pertain to acts that we as a civilized world have decided are so egregious that they cannot be enacted anywhere. Torture is among those types of legal norms. There does not need to be any sort of treaty, and our courts have said as much. Our courts have said there is no dissent that customary international law, such as found in the UN Charter or the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which we have said is customary international law, prohibiting torture is binding on all of us everywhere and at any time. We have also enacted treaties. We have signed and ratified the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture, both of which prohibit torture under any circumstances. There can be no justification for torture. And when we ratify these treaties, it means that they are applicable to all levels of government. So let me just read you from our supremacy clause in our own Constitution, our federal Constitution. It could not be more clear, and it states, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be made pursuant thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." And at the time of ratification, the Senate said, we don't really need to enact any kind of significant federal legislation because torture is already prosecutable in every jurisdiction within the United States. We've enacted federal laws to assure compliance with treaty requirements. Nonetheless, the Federal Torture Act of 1994 was brought into reality to make sure that the United States was in full compliance with our obligation not to torture. So we have not complied with these obligations, but this bill really goes a long way to assure that we can do so now. It aligns the state with regard to definitions and obligations that match up with our international obligations. It begins the process by which our state can acknowledge that events of rendition, disappearance, torture took place, and make transparent the human rights violations that individuals have suffered. The bill's requirement that airports adopt policies that would prohibit participation by any airport tenants or aviation users is critical, again, to lining up with our international obligations. And so I hope that this bill goes where it needs to be, which is passage, because we will then be able to raise our heads as good international human rights citizens. Thank you.
I'm Jennifer Copeland, North Carolina Council of Churches, and I greet you on behalf of the 18 denominations that make up the North Carolina Council of Churches. All of these people who stand behind me and spoke ahead of me told you about what happened in North Carolina, and they told you how it happened. They mentioned that information gleaned through torture is seldom, if ever, reliable, so you know the facts on the ground now. I'm going to suggest to you a reason for why we did it anyway. Why the United States did it anyway, why North Carolina participated. And what I have to say is more about us and less about the 49 people we know who were victims of torture on our watch in our state. You know about them. If you don't know about them, you can read about them in the Commission's report on the website. I want to tell you about us. The truth is, cruelty comes naturally to us. To humans, I mean, not maybe this particular group of people in the room. We're pretty nice people here in the room. but cruelty comes naturally to humanity in general. We all read Lord of the Flies, didn't we, when we were in high school? And if you haven't read Lord of the Flies, you can see it at work on the schoolyard grounds. Generally speaking, our cruelty is driven by fear and greed. We want more, and we're afraid someone else will get it. Sometimes we are genuinely afraid for our lives, afraid that someone will take that from us. And in the early 2000s, I think that's a lot of what was going on in this country. Maybe it still is going on in this country. But we had it in spades, starting September the 11th, 2001. Because this fear and greed is our natural inclination, nearly every faith tradition practiced by humanity puts the brakes on this behavior. My own faith tradition, Christianity, recently celebrated Easter, with all the flowers and all the children and all the festivity. In that celebration, we confess that peace is the only way to real life. We confess to follow a Savior who would die rather than fight back against an unjust system. And we tell that story every year to remind ourselves that without these stories, we will always regress to our baser selves. The stories tell us we can be better than we are. We can be people generous enough not to be afraid when we lose something. We can be brave enough not to torture others when we are afraid. And most importantly, we can admit when we have done something wrong. We're here today to admit that rendition, detention, and interrogation are wrong. We are here to confess that we can be better. Some of us may recall the story told in Christian communities around the world Friday, 2 weeks ago. The story about when they came for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. They came out to arrest him with swords and clubs, as if he were a bandit. And one of his disciples took a sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus touched his ear and healed it. And Jesus said, "No more of this. No more of this." Thank you.